Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Given the earlier discussion and the secret that Fatima has now revealed about me, of learning to make samosas, and given what Sheikh Ismail spoke about earlier and the question that was asked about poverty, I learned to make samosas because of poverty. When I married my husband, I thought we'll be okay because we were both professionals. At the time, I didn't know that he had a government bursary, was going to earn the salary of a teacher, and had to repay the bursary. And so we had very little money. And I thought I have to do something, because if matters are difficult, you don't just sit back and allow them to overwhelm you. You have to find something to respond to that challenge. And so I learned to make samosas from the wife of the owner of the shop at which we used to buy vegetables and fruit. And those samosas sustained us. When I began selling them, I didn't have to use cotton nappies for my son. I could buy Huggies. So poverty helps you to learn lessons of life. And I think what you should never do is allow yourself, in English they say, to wallow, to sink in poverty. You will always, with the help of Allah, you will find a way. And the reason that we are made as we are is that the Almighty has given us this skill, this power of discernment, of being able to recognize where there is an opportunity and we have the ability to learn. So never say, oh Allah, you've put me in this position, there's nothing I can do. I don't believe it's true. I believe that we have been created in order to try and look for the best solutions in ourselves, but in the life we have to live as well. But let me stop all that, because I'm not a theologian, and let me come to my remarks. One of the consequences of aging is poor eyesight. So I'm going to just ask for I have a red handbag there. Thank you, I've got my glasses there. Thank you very much. So last night when we were speaking with Fatima, she asked me, when you have to speak, do you speak off the cuff or do you prepare? Well, I'm a person who's quite nervous about saying the wrong thing. So I prepare, I write. And this is something that I just like doing because I think the worst thing is to be extemporaneous and then you put your foot in your mouth. Then you can be in trouble. So allow me to begin. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of this important event for inviting me to speak at this conference. The theme I was given is 30 years of democracy in South Africa and the learning that we need to draw from these decades. I believe it is important to acknowledge that much progress has been achieved in South Africa, since the demise of apartheid in the formal sense. We often forget that apartheid was a set of laws. It was de jure, to the laws that governed our lives. But of course we know that de facto, our reality is that the legacy of apartheid lingers firmly within our society and our communities. We see the reality of that lingering legacy every day in our lives. Of course, this presence should not be surprising. The historians who are present in the room today will tell you that social transitions after war, after struggle, after natural disasters take many decades to overcome. And I've often found it odd intellectually that in South Africa, we do not appreciate this notion of time for transition. And we seem to expect that all change from our legacy can be achieved very speedily. Well, history teaches us that it can't. Nonetheless, I believe there is much that is positive for South Africans to celebrate. Firstly, our country has adopted a very progressive constitution that enshrines civil, political, and socioeconomic rights. There are some in our communities who do not value our constitution because they believe that the Constitution of South Africa should reflect majority perspectives of particular religious or ethnic groups. Our Constitution is progressive, however, in that it protects all and recognizes and affirms the diversity of South Africa. I believe the most significant feature of the Constitution is the trumping role of the Equality Clause. I especially enjoyed today the input that was given by Maulana Zakaria. And the reason I enjoyed it was he spent a lot of time speaking of the concept of equality. And I thought that he gave us a very interesting insight into the Quranic perspective on ourselves as women and our fellow human beings, men, by saying we are viewed as equal with different attributes depending on a range of factors that are biological or other elements that he referred to. But what I thought was striking, and he didn't stress this, but it struck me, was that right at the inception of the Quran, when Allah addresses us, begins, "O mankind." It doesn't begin, "O man, O woman." "O mankind." This notion encapsulates that notion that Maulana Zakaria spoke about so well today. And I thank you, Maulana, for speaking about equality. One of the aspects that is extremely important is, of course, that in our Constitution, we also incorporate, if you remember, in the Bill of Rights, which is Chapter 3 of our Constitution, we incorporate the right to culture, the right to language, the right to freedom of religion. But there's a trumping aspect to all these rights, and that is none of them can be exercised in a manner that promotes inequality, prejudice, or discrimination against an individual or a group. The second aspect of celebration of our democracy is that these provisions have led to the development of important progressive legislation in our country. So, for example, we have the right to culture. And the Parliament had to discuss, how do we codify, how do we shape a law that gives effect to this right without offending the right to equality? And so you have in South Africa customary law legislation that allows and sets out the rights, particularly of women and children in customary marriages. Because previously, in the absence of codified law, in the absence of a Bill of Rights, women in customary law settings suffered a great deal of prejudice and discrimination. Customary law as well, this new set of laws address inheritance, succession, and other complex issues of inequality in customary law. The statutes that we have developed have changed legal practice in our courts in an effort to protect children, to protect women, and to protect the labor force in our country. We can just look at the fact of the recent appointment of our first female Chief Justice, which underscores the progress achieved through our new dispensation. I raise these issues because I have observed that South Africans tend to be very pessimistic about their country and are sometimes its worst critics. And yet, we live in one of the best constitutional states in the world, but we don't always appreciate it. And I'll say more about that later. The third aspect relates to the advances that we have achieved in socioeconomic rights, and I believe these are critical for our society. I recall, for example, the first policy speech of President Nelson Mandela in 1994, when he introduced, at that inception of our democracy, the policy of 10 years of compulsory education, a policy which has resulted in millions of children attending school, and in South Africa, in 30 years, achieving near universal school enrollments with girls and boys equally in school in our country. This is incredible for 30 years of freedom. And if you don't believe me, I would like you to go and look at the adoption of the Magna Carta in Britain, and then look at when they adopted compulsory education. We also, of course, have had the policy of increased access to health care for the poor, which has resulted in thousands of clinics throughout our country and in increased provision of primary health care. Our government has supported the health sciences training of our young people and increased the number of qualified doctors in our country through the Mandela Castro Cuban Medical Training Program. We've also had access in socioeconomic rights of water access, electricity access, and access to housing. When I spoke in this very hall in June earlier this year, and I mentioned water access, the audience got very angry because they were having a lot of water access problems at the time. And I know it's a sore subject, but for many millions of South Africans who never enjoyed such access before, the situation is vastly different in 30 years from what they knew in 1994. Many of our academic researchers in our universities confirm that although our progress is still inadequate, the level of achievement in just 30 years of democracy is remarkable. And I challenge you to read your reviews of every decade done by independent researchers, to read the annual reports of the Human Sciences Research Council, and to look at a range of research from academics throughout the higher education sector in our country in order to get the evidence from research of what I am asserting today. A fourth aspect I wish to refer to is that of science and innovation, which I believe has been one of the most exciting sectors of progress. Universities in our country, such as the University of KwaZulu-Natal, University of Cape Town, University of Pretoria, Witwatersrand, University of Fort Hare, recently University of Limpopo, and more recently University of Venda, have expanded their research profiles to world-class levels in a range of disciplines. Scientists, for example, at the University of KwaZulu-Natal played a key role in supporting government to understand the science of combating COVID-19. Researchers such as Professor Salim Karim and Professor Quraisha Karim have led international HIV research efforts and developed diagnostics and treatments that advance our scientific knowledge. We have Professor Tibello Nyokong and her team of young women researchers at Rhodes University who have led innovation and treatments discovery at the University of Rhodes for female cancers. We have scientists such as Professor Joanne de la Marre, who has led innovation at Rhodes University in developing treatments for cervical cancer. All of these are globally recognized as innovative outcomes of South African research. These are just a few examples of excellent scientific work being done in democratic South Africa. Our scientists have put even dangerous nuclear sciences to positive work through becoming a top producer of nuclear isotopes. We have also made progress in the building of big research infrastructure, such as the Square Kilometre Array and our satellite development program at the Space Agency of South Africa. We are a country that is now recognized as having taken the lead in the peaceful use of nuclear capabilities. Last week, I had the privilege of meeting the acting Judge President of the Western Cape, Judge Patricia Goliath. She described in her talk her path to the judgeship and the opportunities opened up to her and other female lawyers by freedom and democracy. Her colleagues, Judge Rahana Parker, and several advocates who lead their own law firms also shared their stories of freedom and democracy. We see this positive empowerment reflected in the political sphere. In 1994, some of you will recall, President Mandela appointed only 2 ministers, and women were very angry. Today, our cabinet has equal representation of women and men. We have a 50-50 cabinet in South Africa today. Our parliament has over 30% women representatives, and the presiding officers, the speaker and the chairperson of both houses, are female. So our country has made progress. But of course, I know in your heads, being South Africans, there is the but, right? We always have the but. So I have to admit, being an honest intellectual, that despite all this progress, we all know that equality is still a challenging goal for millions of women. I believe our biggest negative is gender-based violence and femicide. This national shame is strongly linked to our culture of chauvinist masculinity and the social engineering that has inculcated negative stereotypes about the relationship between men and women. And it's a culture we have to challenge. The culture of violence, the culture of disdain, the culture of disrespect for women, which was promoted under apartheid, continues today and needs urgent social attention. We, in our communities, our families, our schools, and all our social institutions need to change this culture, supported, of course, by law enforcement. But it is not the sole responsibility of the police. We have a role to play in our families and communities as well. And often we don't talk about this sufficiently. I recall once being at a meeting where a senior colleague was to speak. She was a Muslim lady, and she was going to talk about the experience of marriage. I had thought her talk was going to be a most happy and enthralling talk, but she chose to talk about the impact of divorce on Muslim women, particularly if you're senior, over 50, and the treatment that women in our community are subjected to in such a circumstance. I think part of a challenge we confront is we have to also talk about the negatives within our community and how we should address them. I know that we do focus on learning our religion, on understanding its core values and principles, but I think sometimes we should also talk about those who misinterpret our religion, who misrepresent it, who misguide others, who create this toxic masculinity among our young men by teaching them the wrong approaches, the wrong attitude, and very negative stereotypes. These are subjects we must not avoid, and we should ask our ulama to devote more time, because they know who some of these gentlemen are, and they should help us to educate these gentlemen and shame them on their disgraceful behavior toward their wives, their sisters, and their daughters. It's a challenge we confront, as with all communities, and it is one that we must give urgent attention to. I believe another challenge that confronts South Africa is a need to find a way of this two-track society we are creating, a society in which it would appear we believe urban is good, rural is bad. A large proportion of our nation is in the rural setting of our country. And yet we are very poor at rural development. I believe we have to focus on the task of rural development, and in particular, ensure we provide empowerment support for women and children who live in these communities. Because the majority of those who live in our rural domain are largely marginalized women and children who are not being cared for fully. So I believe rural empowerment and development is a key task South Africa must undertake. Of course, I'm aware there are many empowerment efforts by a range of community-based organizations, but many of the best and biggest NGOs tend to focus on the urban setting and neglect rural communities. We also need to look at access to land for production, access to information, communication technology services, and access to business support for entrepreneurs in the rural setting, aspects that are largely neglected and inadequate. More of us should find ways of servicing and empowering these communities. Success in this area would lead to more improved livelihoods and fundamental transformation of our society. I would like, as I move toward conclusion, to say that it is important to record that one of the more critical achievements of our 3 decades has been the adoption and implementation of a human rights-oriented, independent foreign policy. It is this policy, as announced by President Mandela in 1995, that has contributed to South Africa's steadfast solidarity with the people of Palestine and their just cause for freedom and justice. South Africa believes that all people must enjoy human dignity and freedom from oppression, colonialism, and injustice. This is a basic tenet in our country. This belief is firmly linked to our history of struggle against apartheid and to the lessons that our freedom fighters handed to us as our legacy. Our struggle embraced progressive human rights, and we set these out for the first time in 1955 in the Freedom Charter that was adopted in Kliptown in Johannesburg, led at that time in development by the African National Congress. The Freedom Charter stated as follows: "There shall be friendship among all nations, and all disputes and conflicts shall be settled by negotiations and a search for peace." We also know, those of us who read and study, we also know that our struggle entrenched the practice of international solidarity, the practice of isolation, and the practice of sanctions as strategic supports for struggle. As I've said before on international solidarity, I take it to the community level, and I talk about that auntie who is hosting a Muslimah, and she finds she has run out of basmati rice. And she goes to her neighbor because she intends to make the best lamb biryani. So she goes to her neighbor to say, "I have run out, can you give me a few cups of basmati rice?" And indeed, in solidarity, her neighbor understands the importance of a Muslimah, and she says, "Of course, here you are. Take what you need." A few months later, her neighbor has a big occasion, and she's in trouble. She also doesn't have enough of a supply. So she goes to her neighbor, and she says, "I'm sure you have now stocked up on that basmati. I'm in a bit of a spot here. Would you assist me?" Your neighbor having helped you, you can't say, hey, I have a lot of visitors tomorrow, I can't help you. Solidarity means you say, here you are. We went to the Palestinians and many other nations, and we said, we want to train our freedom fighters. And the people of Palestine, even under oppression at that time, they said, we will train them. We will hold hands with you in fighting against apartheid. So now, when they need assistance, we cannot say, no, we're busy with democracy, we are free, we don't have time. It's our obligation to always practice international solidarity. It is the underlying lesson of our struggle for freedom. So when South Africa, when anyone asks you, as they do me, why is South Africa so solidly supporting the cause of Palestine? We must say we are acting in terms of the key values and principles of our Constitution. We are acting in terms of the lessons we acquired from our struggle for freedom against apartheid. And all our actions are part of our legacy of struggle. So the fact that our government decided to approach the International Court of Justice serves as a confirmation of this support. But more importantly, it serves to confirm our support for what is called multilateralism. And let me explain it. We believe that the only institution that can be called a true multilateral representative of all nations of the world is the United Nations. We don't believe there's a country that can replicate and try to be a country that directs all our nations. We believe there must be an organization in which we are all sovereign, equal nations. And that body is the United Nations. So we decided that as South Africa's government then, we would approach a United Nations body, the highest court globally, the International Court of Justice. And in that way, we were signaling three important things, I believe. Firstly, that all persons must be held to account for their actions on the global stage. Secondly, that the institutions we have created to protect innocent civilians must be utilized and challenged to carry out that task. And thirdly, we were rejecting unipolarity. That is the notion that there are some countries that are so powerful that no one can challenge them. So South Africa, by approaching the International Court of Justice, did a very important thing. I think fourth, and perhaps most important, for many, many decades, Israel has been allowed impunity to act as it will against the people of Palestine, without a lot of international approbation or condemnation of their actions. We felt that it is important we go to a court where matters are submitted in the public, where evidence is required, and where you have to argue as the one bringing the case and as the respondent. And you would have seen, if you were observing the case at the ICJ, that it's very difficult when you're accused of genocide and you know you've been carrying out acts of war crime. You can't defend yourself. It's indefensible, because we have all seen it. So South Africa was able to table a very cogent set of data of harm And the Israeli lawyers struggled to present the Israeli perspective because it's indefensible. So I believe that you and the whole of South Africa did something extremely important by going to the International Court of Justice. Because for the first time, the veneer, the protection of impunity was torn wide open, and the harm being done was visible to all the world. Whether they wish to deny it or to agree that it is true, it was open to the world, and it is us, the people of South Africa, who have done that, and we must continue to do so. It is my belief that we, in civil society, need to continue our efforts at publicly calling for freedom and justice for the people of Palestine. We should work across communities and across faiths to mount a civil society campaign that will call on all countries to join this cause of justice. I believe as South Africans, we need to act on this task in order to honor the view of President Mandela that South Africa will not be completely free until Palestine is free. So President Mandela has left us, you and I, with a task that we have to carry out. And I do worry that we think that a campaign must be a campaign of incidents. One protest here and there, one action here and there. No. We must protest regularly. We must have an agreed campaign. We should be writing to the newspapers. We should be speaking on all radio programs. We should have watchers, listeners, who listen, and we know someone is saying something that is totally dishonest. We phone in. We phone, say, Rihanna, can you phone SAFM? There's a speaker there who's just totally dishonest and lying about what's happening to the people of Palestine. And Rihanna would phone in. We organize around 100 such people. And if we do that, slowly but surely our campaign will begin to achieve strength. And we do this not just South Africa, but all over. We find out who are in support. And we'll find, as our liberation movement found, that there is a large part of the world that is ready to stand up for morality. But it's only when you test that morality that you get the adherence. So we need a massive civil society campaign. I've said to other colleagues that that campaign has to have all the features of South Africa's struggle against apartheid. We must have mass mobilization. We have to have an underground network in Palestine that we support. We must achieve international solidarity. And if need be, we must provide support to an armed struggle. Those were the 4 pillars of our struggle. And so we must look at what we can do to give life to those 4 in order to ensure that in our lifetime, the belief of President Mandela is realized in practical terms, that we will only be free truly if Palestinian people are free. So, while indeed in the 30 years, our journey has been one of progress, has been one of missteps, has been one of failures, I believe overall we have tried to do well. There are some really positive achievements, and I believe that in the future, with hard work, with commitment, with faith, I believe we can do much better. Now, my dear sister Fatima, I decided I wouldn't speak forever because I'm sure there are lots of questions and it would be good to have a discussion. So let me say, shukran for listening to me and assalamu alaikum.